Greetings. Today, I would like to share some thoughts on intimacy, a feeling of closeness and oneness with nature. But even though I'm using nature as my example here, you'll find that these ideas of intimacy can apply to anything in your life that you want to become closer to. My name is Kenton Whitman, and I believe in you. Here is a little secret about the world that you probably have realized already, but if you haven't, it's that whatever culture we're brought up in, we're brought up with a set of beliefs and ideas about the world. I'm going to call them models of reality. And coming up in a certain culture, we tend to think and believe that our model is not only the most sophisticated, but that it is correct, that it is the real one, where other people's models are false. And it doesn't really matter what we've been brought up in, whether we grew up in an atheist household or we grew up in an Islamic household, we grew up in a Buddhist household. Whatever the framework is that we've used to see the world, we're going to think that we're right on. Now sometimes, and here's one of the amazing things about the human experience, we can begin to look critically at our models of reality. And when we do that, we have the power to either strengthen them because we've looked at them very closely and we've found great truth in them, or sometimes when we look critically, we will find those ideas, those beliefs, those models to be challenged and sometimes changed. When it comes to intimacy, closeness, most of us have learned a very certain way of being in the world because of our dominant current culture. And that way tends to make us feel fairly isolated for a lot of us. I call it the mechano-linear mindset, or the mechano-linear model of reality. And in this model, we see things much as machines. The world is composed of all sorts of different machines. This tree behind me here, this one is a machine. It can be dissected into moving parts. There's no spirit to it. It's just a machine. And linear comes from the idea that we tend to think in very straight lines. Very cause and effect. If you are familiar with sociology or some of the science, if you've heard the term proximal or proximate cause, that's what I'm talking about with the linear mindset. Most of us think when I think, okay, what causes the sap to rise in the tree in the spring? I think of that in a proximal way. I'm trying to think of the immediate effects, and that's how our world looks at it and says, well, it's because of the pressures in the tree that creates a vacuum. So there's a similar quandary that comes when a child asks, why does the sun come up over the horizon? And there again, we say, well, it's because of the earth turning. But there's also something called an ultimate cause, or a distal cause. And that cause is looking at the world more wholly, more fully. stuck in this mechano-linear mindset, we feel pretty distant from things. What if we could shift our mindset, these basic foundations, these basic assumptions about life, in a way that would not only give us a feeling of closeness, but would increase our ability to connect. In the woods, that means being able to be more quiet and get closer to animals. That means seeing more things, having heightened awareness, noticing that mushroom that's hidden down there that is a wonderful wild edible. With people, it can mean deeper emotional closeness, less fights, less anxiety, less frustration. You see, something we're not taught is that our basic worldview, our basic model that we are approaching life with, this has a profound effect on the world that we experience. Imagine you are walking into a room of people. If I walk into that room of people with the underlying assumption that these are low-class people, they are stupid, they really don't know anything about the world, and it's hardly worth my time to be here, I am probably going to have a very, very different experience of what I call reality than the experience that I'll have if I walk into that room thinking, I'm very curious about these people. I haven't met them. I'm very open-minded. I wonder what motivates them, what they find important in life, what they believe in, what they cherish. It doesn't take much to see that the underlying assumptions, the underlying worldview that I walk into that room with is going to affect the conversations that I have. It's going to affect what I learn. It's going to affect that entire experience, because how I approach something makes a huge difference. When we're talking about relationships of any kind, which is what we're talking about when I speak of intimacy, the way we approach things, it's vital. It's going to make all the difference. Let's come back to that mechano-linear mindset. I walk out into the woods with my mechano-linear mindset, and I see everything as little machines. Now, this can be a very fascinating way to see the world. There's nothing wrong with it. But I do find that it limits the intimacy that we're going to have with nature. As I look around myself, I'm going to be thinking about the mechanics. I'm going to be largely in my mind. And when I walk with somebody in the woods who thinks largely about the mechanics, they'll have fascinating things to share, and I'll often learn a lot. But they're going to miss a lot of things too. They don't tend to see animals. They don't tend to see plants, because we're stuck in our head, right? Our mind, if it's thinking, it's not going to be sensing. It's usually doing basically one or the other. Now, if we can reshift and start to think of ourselves as very intimately connected with all of this, then, wow, the world out here changes. I start to no longer resist things. This is probably the biggest part of this. When you see students go through the ice out here, and often, for instance, if you saw Hunter, I think on the other channel, he went through and just was very, very calm about it. You can't do that when you're actively resisting the world. Again, if I walk into that room and I don't even want to be there and I'm resisting it, Very different than if I go in with curiosity and open-mindedness. Losing that resistance becomes very easy when I think of myself as part of all of this. There are other benefits that come. I start to see more. Because when I feel like I'm part of all of this, I tend to move into my senses more. I simply think less because we become fascinated with this connection. When I feel like it's part of who I am, then there's a connection there that I just can't feel if I'm thinking of it as a machine. And I begin to notice things about it. I see the little salve, the little scratches where the squirrel has gone up its bark. I might taste it, smell it. We almost start to fall in love with the world. If we really want to experience this, it's also important to understand that if I think of myself, oh, I am one with all of this, that's very kind of a superficial thought that doesn't soak into my being. That's a very popular thought, this thought of oneness. And for a long time, I personally said, I'm one with all these things. But I didn't feel it. It wasn't visceral. And so what I would like to leave you with here are some ways to start to make that visceral. To start to really break down that mechanolinear mindset and start to look at it more critically. This has been happening in our sciences. We're seeing a slow shift away from this idea of everything being a separate unit into seeing a larger connection. Ecology, of course, is the science of understanding all these interconnections, the web of life. Now, if you have not heard of the Wood Wide Web, this would be a fun thing that I would suggest that you explore a little bit, look it up online. And what you're going to start to see is some remarkable science being done that is showing that these trees in the forest, they're not independent beings. They're connected with fungi that are so intimately interact with their roots that the trees often cannot survive without those fungi. And those fungi, there are tubes that transport nutrients. In those tubes, we can't separate them out from that tree, and they reach on over to other trees, sometimes trees of other species. And there's sharing of nutrients that's going on between trees. And sometimes it's fascinating. Sometimes it's a huge tree that has lots of access and reach to the sky. And it sometimes will take nutrients and funnel those to a small struggling tree of a different species that's not getting enough sun. What's happening? We're just beginning to understand. But it's becoming clear that there is an interconnectedness out here in the woods where it might be more correct to think of a woodland as a single living unit rather than a whole bunch of little separate units. Here's where our mechanolinear mindset, again, we want to jump in and say, no, it's just a bunch of separate machines and they're linked up in cause and effect relationship. And that may be a very viable way to see the world. But remember, the way we see the world is going to affect our experience of it. As illustrated, hopefully, by that example of walking into the room of people earlier in the video. This is not much different than our bodies. You may know that there are many cells in your body that have your DNA, but there are many, many cells and bacteria and other creatures inside of you that do not possess your DNA. They're entirely different creatures. But without these creatures, you would not survive a moment. So, as we asked in that other video, are we air? Are we separate from those creatures? Can we meaningfully speak of ourselves as not being one unit with those other creatures inside of us? Because you, me, we would not stand here if all those other creatures were suddenly taken out of us. Are we an ecosystem? And how connected are we to the ecosystem that we're in? Our cultures, they change. We all know very well that the cultures of 1,000 years ago, if we look back at the writings and the ideas that they left us, our ideas, our beliefs are very different now. And they're always shifting and changing. Things are changing very quickly as we speak. 100 years from now, we might look back and snicker at some of the beliefs and ideas that we hold and cherish as real, as solid today. One of the places that I believe we're seeing change is in beginning to see the world more holistically, more ecologically. There's the Wood Wide Web. You can look up how much of our body is not us. We could research apex predators. There's a wonderful TED Talk, and there's some studies on Yellowstone, what happened when wolves were reintroduced, and how famously they changed the way that the rivers flow. How can this be? Things are more connected than we've been led to believe. And the more we start to explore those ideas, the more we're going to break down that mechano-linear mindset, the more we're going to see it more critically. And the more we're going to move ourselves in the direction of seeing things ecologically, interconnected, more intimately. The feeling this gives us is amazing. It has practical benefits, and it just feels great. It feels wonderful when we no longer feel isolated from the world. Well, we just smile. I think you'll see amazing results. When I look at my wife and I see her as a separate entity, then we tend to just have more, well, in the past, we would have more disagreements, more arguments. But when I see myself as almost as one thing with her, then it brings me to a new state of responsibility. If I walk downstairs and I'm in a sour mood, I know that's going to impact the ecosystem in the kitchen. And I no longer then can feel the same frustration or attack her if she starts to respond or react to the mood that I've brought into that ecosystem. I think in the end, this is what it comes down to. comes down to a sense of responsibility. And I don't mean that in a negative way, like all the weight of the world is upon you. But it's a realization that as I walk into any ecosystem, human, woods, go swimming, that I'm impacting that ecosystem. That I am so intimately tied with that ecosystem that I can't ignore what I'm bringing into it. This turns our gaze inward, realizing that my inward state, it affects the outward state that I experience. It affects the people around me. Here in the woods, if someone tromps down the path in an angry mood, deer scatter. Someone walks quietly, feeling intimately connected with the woods. We've had deer actually walk up towards people. This world is vastly more mysterious, vastly more amazing than we've been led to believe, my friends. The mindset we've been taught, it can be very limiting. Even the most rigorous scientist will admit, I would hope, that we can understand maybe the mechanics of the world, but the deeper questions of the world, they're not available to our current mindset. We've been taught a very certain way of looking at the world. What happens if we question that? We start to look at it more critically. We study some of this new science coming out. And we become explorers and adventurers. We start to say, I wonder what I'm going to find. I wonder what I'm going to find in the world. If I can set some of my assumptions aside and explore some new assumptions. I don't think we have to fear this. We'll see that fear manifest often, especially if you are watching YouTube videos where people are talking about science or religion. People, and interestingly, often science-minded people, becoming very, very emotional about defending their view of the world. We don't have to fear. We don't have to jump into that and defend and defend and defend. Defending, we can only do that when we're insecure about what we're seeing in the world. Curiosity, exploration, it's not going to get us into trouble. It's only going to lead us down to deeper understanding. No matter what story of life we're subscribing to right now, whether we call ourselves atheists or we call ourselves Christians or anything else, the more we look at life and explore life, the more that we're going to see things. We may deepen our relationship, our belief in the story that we currently have. And we may find that there's things we can add to that story or subtract from that story. But if we live in fear and we refuse to look and explore, then we just become stuck. If you have explored these thoughts about our foundational reality, our models, thoughts about interconnectedness, please share in the comments below. Thank you for watching, my friends.